Hello. Today we continue the conversation with Anatoly Fomenko about the application of the method of form codes for identifying duplicates of historical figures. Anatoly Timofeyevich, hello.
Hello, Svetlana.
Anatoly Timofeyevich. To this day, you, along with Gleb Nosovsky, have discovered 124 reflections of Jesus Christ in historical documents and literary works. Can we consider the Byzantine Emperor Andronikos I Komnenos and the Russian Grand Prince Andrei Bogolyubsky as the main reflections of Christ? Or are all the duplicates you have found equivalent?
Of course not. To this day, we have discovered more than 100 phantom reflections of Christ. And today, it can be said that the originals of these narratives, these legends, are two biographies. The first one is the biography of Grand Prince Andrei Bogolyubsky during his time in Russia. And the second one is the biography of Emperor Andronikos Komnenos, Andronikos Christ, during his time in Tsargrad. These two biographies are the originals. All the numerous duplicates are based on them and were pushed into the distant past due to errors that were made in the Scaligerian chronology.
Please tell us more about this.
In this chart, you can see the genealogy of Emperor Andronikos Komnenos. Here he is at the bottom. He reigned as emperor for 3 years from 1182 to 1185. At the top is Alexios Komnenos, the founder of the dynasty in the late 11th and early 12th centuries. Manuel had a son, Alexios II Komnenos, whom he wanted to pass the throne to. In addition, Andronikos Komnenos, a close relative of Manuel, also had a right to the throne. According to the genealogical table, Andronikos Komnenos was the son of Isaac Komnenos, the full brother of Emperor John, making Andronikos Manuel's half-brother on his father's side. According to some chronicles, he was his nephew. Right now, this is not important, and we will discuss it later. Now very briefly, as a preview, let's go through the biographies of Emperor Andronikos and why this comparison became famous in Byzantine history and European history in general. After becoming emperor, Andronikos significantly limited the expenses of the court and took decisive action to root out the abuses of officials and the nobility. By the way, the biography of Andronikos Komnenos is contained in the famous work of the Byzantine chronicler Nikitas Choniates. The previous Byzantine historian, John Kinemis, also provides a lot of information about him. There is quite a lot of information about Andronikos, and it is very vivid. Moreover, the attitude, for example, of Nikitas Choniates towards Andronikos is strongly negative. And it's understandable why. As I mentioned, Andronikos significantly limited the power and influence of the nobility, which caused significant irritation, and the chronicler Nikitas Choniates himself belonged to the nobility. Andronikos provided generous gifts to the poor subjects. I quote Nikitas Choniates, "He so punished the greed of the very powerful, and he so restricted the hands of those who reached out for the properties of others, that the majority of the provinces increased their population." An appeal to Andronikos was like a deadly enchantment, a spell that dispersed the tax collectors, a bugbear terrible to the ear of those who collected more than was authorized, and a benumbing paralysis of the hands which heretofore were concerned only with taking first. And so on and so forth. The nobility, including Emperor Andronikos' close relatives, were naturally dissatisfied. They believed that he was mistreating the nobility, and as a result, a conspiracy formed against Andronikos. Nikitas Choniates describes Andronikos' rule from the perspective of his opponents, painting a dark picture. Later historians, relying on the history of Byzantium, also often spoke of Emperor Andronikos as having organized unprecedented terror against the nobility. Finally, at the end of the 12th century, a revolt broke out in Tsargrad against Andronikos. At that time, he was at his country villa. The revolt was in favor of Isaac Angelos. In Byzantium, there were two families, the Angelos family and the Komnenos family, and they were related. Isaac Angelos, a representative of the competing Angelos family, led the rebellion against Andronikos. Andronikos tried to suppress the uprising and personally arrived in the capital, but he was unable to do so. Then, along with a few of his associates, he attempted to escape to Russia, as reported by Nikitas Koniates. However, a terrible storm in the Black Sea disrupted their escape. Pursuers sent after him, captured the emperor and brought him back to Tsargrad. Andronikos was tortured and then publicly executed in the Hippodrome. As we have found using the method of form codes, the description of his torture and execution remarkably resembles the Gospel account of the Passion and Crucifixion of Christ, as well as the accounts of Christ's life from other early Christian sources. The body of Andronikos was taken by certain people, and then Nikitas Koniates provides a strange statement. I quote, "They removed Andronikos' corpse and laid it to rest in the lowest district. Even now it is not completely decomposed, as can be seen by those who wish to look." I want to point out that Nikitas Koniates' work was brought to 1206. Therefore, the words about his corpse not having completely decomposed for at least 2 decades sound strange. Here, either Koniates wanted to conceal something from us, or a later copyist editor did not understand something here. This is a very brief overview of the biography of Emperor Andronikos. Now, let's quickly compare the biography with the information we know about Jesus Christ and Andrei Bogolubsky. First of all, it must be said that Christ Andronikos was the king of the Jews. We all know the famous inscription that was put on the cross of Jesus and even mentioned in the Gospels. Jesus, King of the Jews. Here are some fragments. These are fragments of ancient depictions, icons, paintings showing the placard nailed to the cross on which Christ was crucified. The placard reads, "Jesus the Nazarene, King of the Jews." This canonical phrase is always reproduced in various fonts and variations in hundreds of ancient crucifixion images. In the Gospel of John, it is said, "And Pilate wrote a title, and put it on the cross. And the writing was, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. Then said the chief priests of the Jews to Pilate, Write not, the King of the Jews. Pilate answered, What I have written I have written." This is from the Gospel of John. The dispute between the chief priests and the procurator Pilate was quite understandable. Andronikos' Christ had been dethroned, so his opponents demanded that Pilate exclude the word king. Indeed, for a recently dethroned king, the question of whether to write his royal title was debatable. However, Pilate insisted on his decision. We can see that the title king is present in relation to Christ in both the Gospels and in images, and this is natural. I also show numerous depictions of the placard on Christ's cross. For example, on the left, Jesus, Nazarenus, Rex Judeorum, King of the Jews. and so on and so forth. Next are several excerpts from the method of form codes. The Decree of Andronikos, known from Nikitas Koniat's text, written by the will of God. This is a well-known narrative that Nikitas Koniates clearly no longer understands. It refers to a certain text that Andronikos wrote by the will of God. Next is the Apostolic Sermon of Andronikos and the Baptism of Russia. This also surfaces in the Biography of Andronicos as documented by Nikitas Koniates. Russian customs at the court of Andronikos Christ. This narrative is quite well known. Even our historian Karamzin reports that Andronikos, as we have in the Chronicles, visited Yaroslav, Prince of Halych in 1165 and returned to Tsargrad in the same year. Andronikos hunted bison, which were abundant in Russia. Byzantine chroniclers say that Andronikos relied on the Russians more than on the Greeks, and thinking of leaving for Russia on the Tsar's galley, he put on a barbarian cap with a pointed top. This is a quote from Karamzin. Nikitas Koniates reports that Emperor Manuel was concerned about Andronikos' escape because he was gathering a large Scythian cavalry with the intention of invading Roman territory. The close ties between Emperor Andronikos and Russia are documented not only by Nikitas Koniates but also by John Kinemas and other chronicles. Further, the wanderings of Andronikos before his ascension and the wanderings of Christ before his entry into Jerusalem. These are also vivid narratives that overlap when comparing the biographies using the method of form codes. The Gospels report that Joseph and Mary, and later Christ, were forced to wander far from Jerusalem, fearing Herod and subsequently his successor Archelaus. These wanderings began with the flight to Egypt and continued for quite some time. Similarly, Andronikos Komnenos is reported to have wandered extensively through various countries. There is a long list of well-known events associated with Andronikos' wanderings. The method of form codes yields a good overlap of these narrative fragments. Next, the miracles of Andronikos and the miracles of Christ. The Gospels speak extensively about the miracles performed by Christ. It turns out that Emperor Andronikos also performed miracles. This is reported by Nikitas Koniates, although he considers these miracles to be fraudulent and attributes them solely to Andronikos' cunning and intelligence. For example, Andronikos could pass through walls. Nikitas Koniates skeptically describes this. We can immediately recognize familiar themes from the Gospels in these accounts. Next, let's continue with the method of form codes. Andronikos' exceptional intelligence. Nikitas Koniates, despite his obvious and undisguised antipathy towards Andronikos, constantly emphasizes Andronikos' exceptional intelligence and remarkable cunning. He says that insidious plots and clandestine intrigues were hatched against Andronikos while others were contrived in the open. But Andronikos swept these away like so many spider webs and scattered them about like children's playthings made of sand, relying on his manliness and the fact that he surpassed his enemies in mother wit to the degree that irrational creatures are inferior to rational ones. I repeat, Nikitas Koniates characterizes Andronikos in this manner despite his skeptical attitude towards him. Further, it is stated about Emperor Andronikos that he was a very learned man and had an interest in the sciences. In the Gospels, we know of specific stories in which it is said that Jesus Christ, even at a young age, astounded everyone with his learning and held discussions with high priests and wise people of his time. Here is a well-known painting depicting these gospel narratives, with the young Jesus among the scholars and high priests, conversing about complex matters. Moving on. The legend of the Golden Age as a vague recollection of Christ's reign. In the mythology of different peoples and in Christian literature, there has long been the idea of a Golden Age. It is believed to have existed very long ago and was characterized by abundant harvests. Hesiod speaks a lot about this. The first generation of humans in the reign of the supreme God enjoyed complete bliss. The fertile lands bore crops without plowing. The Roman poet Ovid also describes a similar picture of the Golden Age. Crops grew without the need for cultivation. Fields turned golden with heavy ears of grain. The method of form codes reveals a similar text in the Biography of Andronicos Christ. Nikitas Koniates uses very similar words to state that a golden age for farmers and the people occurred under Andronikos. The land was very fertile. As a result, the cities quickly grew in population, the land yielded crops 100-fold, and the necessities of life were sold for little. Much is said about how Andronikos did many good things for the people of the Tsargrad kingdom. I'm showing an old painting about the Golden Age. This is already a kind of legend. In the Middle Ages, artists forgot about the original source of this legend and painted it in a very beautiful way, vaguely recalling that all of this actually relates to events in the middle of the 12th century. Another topic worth mentioning when discussing Andronikos Komnenos is the tremendous height of Emperor Andronikos and the great height of Christ in the shroud. I'll remind you that the height of Christ, as measured on the shroud, is 175 to 180 centimeters, which is quite tall for the Middle Ages and even for modern times. Such a person at that time should have been considered tall, simply gigantic. The biographies of Emperor Andronikos speak in detail about the same thing. Nikitas Koniates mentions the enormous height of Emperor Andronikos. He was called a cyclops. His opponents called him majestic. Everyone was amazed by his height. This is written by John Kinemis and Nikitas Koniates. Another theme that emerges when analyzing the biography of Andronikos in comparison to the life and traditions associated with Christ is the split beard of Christ and the split beard of Andronikos. In numerous icons, Christ is depicted with a split beard. For example, we present some examples from various sources. This is a print by Dürer. Look, a split beard, split beard, split, 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 split. This is a Russian depiction of Christ with a split beard. Western European depictions also show a split beard. Also split, split. Moving on. Another Western European depiction shows Christ with a split beard. Further, a similar depiction. This is from Bosch's paintings, a split beard. And it is reported about Andronikos Christ that his beard was split. This is a theme that is deliberately emphasized as a distinctive characteristic of Emperor Andronikos Christ. On its own, this theme, of course, is not proof, but it is included in the flows of form codes we are discussing. It explains the essence of the matter and fits into the chain of coincidences that overlay the biography of Andronikos Christ with the biographies of Andrei Bogolyubsky and Jesus. Next, we briefly look at their biographies. The expulsion of the merchants from the temple is described in both the biography of Andronikos and the biography of Christ. Here are a few more images of Christ with a split beard. Numerous old depictions. In all of them, the beard is depicted as split. Another image of Christ, split beard. Another image, split beard. In other words, it is precisely what Nikitas Koniates speaks of in his biography of Emperor Andronikos. Another theme from the method of form codes is the proto-martyr Stephen, and the first to suffer for Andronikos, Stephen Hagiochristophoриtes. In the history of the Christian Church, it is well known that the first martyr for Christ was Archdeacon Stephen. There are many depictions of this. Here is one of the paintings, the stoning of Archdeacon Stephen. He was the first martyr for Christ. And here are several depictions. This one. Another one. Stephen's opponents stone him. The first to suffer for Christ. Another image. The stoning of the first martyr Stephen, who suffered for Christ. And it turns out that this theme is described by Nikitas Koniates. In the same way, the first to suffer for Emperor Andronikos was Stephen Hagiochristophoриtes. Let's continue. Angels serve Christ, and angels serve Andronikos. Let me remind you that in Byzantine history, the Angelos dynasty is well known, and they were actually called the Angelos. In the Gospels and in Christian literary tradition, much is said about angels who serve Christ. Therefore, it turns out that the Angels is a feudal dynasty in Byzantium. I would like to remind you that the founder of this dynasty was Constantine Angelos, and they serve Emperor Andronikos. Here, we see in the Gospels and in Christian tradition mentions of angels who serve Christ and Emperor Andronikos. From the same dynasty comes Isaac Angelos, who rebelled against Andronikos. Naturally, the method of form codes immediately found that this overlaps with the supreme angel Satan, who rebelled against God. This is a clear trace in the turbulent events during Andronikos Christ's reign in Tsargrad, and in the Christian teachings about angels. Once again, I want to say that one of the angels, Isaac Angelos, betrayed him and later became a king, overthrowing Emperor Andronikos. In Christian tradition and theology, it is also asserted that the supreme angel named Satanael became proud and wanted to be equal to God, thus rebelling against God. This is how Satan, or the fallen angel, came into being. There is a direct analogy between Isaac Angelos and Satan. Christian teachings about Satan are well known, and there is a struggle against him. Archangels battle against Satan. There are many depictions of this type. Here's one of them, a medieval one, and here's another image. The rebellious angel Satan is defeated. Another image shows the fall of the angel who becomes Satan. Another image shows the fallen angel and the archangels battling against him. Moving on. In connection with this comparison of the form codes, there's another overlay. I would like to remind you that in the biography of Emperor Andronikos, we have Isaac Angelos portrayed as Satan, who raised a rebellion against him. It turns out that in Nikitas Koniat's description, there is a vivid scene where Andronikos saw Isaac Angelos as the new king while standing on a gallery under the dome of a temple. As known, in the Gospels, this scene is reflected as the story of the temptation of Christ by the devil on the wing or pinnacle of the temple. Here is a well-known image of the temptation of Christ on the wing of the temple. Continuing, we approach the main events in Andronikos' biography. The Last Supper, Judas' betrayal, the identification of Christ, his arrest, and Pilate's court are all reflected in the biography of Andronikos Komnenos. Moreover, this is mentioned in other Byzantine sources, such as Robert de Clary's The Conquest of Constantinople. The Last Supper takes place. In the Gospels, it is the Last Supper and Christ's prayers in the Garden of Gethsemane. In the biography of Andronikos Christ, the Last Supper is also presented as a night meeting with his supporters in a tavern, where they discuss the recent events unfolding in Tsargrad. This is a print by Dürer, showing the Last Supper of Christ. There are many images of such scenes. I would like to remind you that according to the Gospels, in the Garden of Gethsemane, Christ was betrayed by Judas and was arrested. Then, after Christ's identification by Judas, he faces trial. In the biography of Emperor Andronikos, there is also a scene of his identification, as he tried to hide. Here, the tavern keeper's wife betrays him to the authorities. Further in the biography of Andronikos, there is a story about the Judas' 30 pieces of silver. There is also an analogue of Pilate's trial of Christ. In Nikitas Koniat's account, there is also a scene of washing hands when Pilate hands Christ over to be executed at the request of the people. However, it's not described in the same way as in the Gospels. There is no literal repetition of the Gospels, but nevertheless, an analysis of the core of the description shows that it's the same narrative. Next, there is a striking scene where Isaac Angelos, the fallen angel who rebelled against Christ, drags Andronikos by an iron chain around his neck in Nikitas Koniat's account. In Christian sources, The Passions of Christ, there is also mention of an iron chain placed around Christ's neck during his passion. Even seemingly minor details like these appear both in Nikitas Koniat's biography of Andronikos Christ and in the biography of Jesus in early Christian literature. Here's an image where this iron chain around Christ's neck is depicted by a later artist in the form of a thick rope that encircles him when he was taken for execution. Another image shows a thick rope around Christ's neck. I reiterate that in the early descriptions, specifically in the Passions of Christ, it is said to be an iron chain around Christ's neck, just like in Nikitas Koniat's account. Then, we move on to the most dramatic narratives, the Passion of Christ and the events that served as their prototypes in 12th century Byzantium. The gouged eye of Andronikos and the damaged eye of Christ in the shroud. According to Nikitas Koniat's Biography of Andronicos, during the beating, one of his eyes was gouged out when the rebels seized the emperor, and a bloody revolt took place in Tsargrad, with supporters and opponents of Andronikos' Christ clashing. His gouged eye is reflected in the image on the shroud. A careful analysis indicates that Christ's eye appears to have been damaged. Although not a very clear image, there are still strong arguments in favor of this interpretation when closely examining the image on the shroud. As for the gouged eye, this event is reflected in many stories, not only in Nikitas Koniat's account, but also in ancient Greek mythology, where it turned into the blinding of the Cyclops. There are many images of such scenes. Here, the Cyclops, that is, the god of enormous stature, who is also Andronikos, is struck by an opponent, and his eye is gouged out. Another ancient Greek image shows the blinding of the Cyclops. I repeat, this is a reflection of real events in the 12th century when Emperor Andronikos had his eye gouged out. Next, we have the severed right hand of Andronikos and the presumed tearing of Christ's right hand in the shroud. In the shroud's image, you can see a kind of separation between Christ's wrist and his hand. And in Nikitas Koniat's description of Andronikos' passion, it's mentioned that after he was gouged in the eye and led to crucifixion, his right hand was severed. In the Gospels themselves, there is no mention of Christ's right hand being severed. But Christian tradition has preserved many images that clearly show Christ with his right hand severed. There are numerous such images. It's not commented upon today. However, let's look at one of them. We see an image of severed hands next to Christ. Here are two severed hands. Here is another striking scene, a severed hand, specifically the right hand, lying here, and it's depicted separately. This is a severed right hand, depicted next to Christ. Here is a detailed image. So, the Christian painting tradition remembered this significant event and depicted the severed right hand. Moreover, this narrative later found its way into numerous other symbols associated with Christ and early Christianity. Here are many images of the severed right hand holding a cross. The right hand severed while holding a cross, and so on. There are many such images in contemporary museums. This image is from a museum in Germany, and here is another severed right hand holding a certain symbol. Next is a severed right hand against the background of a cross. Today, you can see this on the walls of churches. This is in Austria, Vienna. Here is another severed right hand against the background of a cross, with the title of Christ nearby, the Lamb. Also, a severed right hand against the background of a cross. Another image is an ancient coat of arms which shows a lamb, a symbol of Christ, and a severed right hand against the background of a red bloody cross. The famous Noah's Ark. Here, too, you can see the symbol of the severed right hand and so on. There are many such images. So, even though the Gospels don't explicitly mention the severed right hand of Christ, we can see that the artistic and sculptural tradition preserved this fact for us in Nikitas Koniat's description of the Passion of Emperor Andronikos Christ, where it is explicitly stated in the text. And finally, the execution of Emperor Andronikos occurs. The Passion of Christ overlaps with the execution of Andronikos according to Nikitas Koniates. The description of the emperor's passion is very harsh. Nikitas Koniates provides many details of the brutal mistreatment of the dethroned emperor: gouged eye, severed right hand, crucifixion, and torture. It is also reported that there were two symbols near him. As Nikitas Koniates writes, two heavy chains weighing down his proud neck, his right hand cut off by an axe. One of his eyes was gouged out, and, seated upon a mangy camel, he was paraded through the agora. I will quote only selected fragments. This is quite a detailed and rather cruel description. A man is led to execution, who had been emperor, as Koniates writes. He had been hailed as savior. Nikitas Koniates mentions the savior's name here. Some struck him on the head with clubs, others befouled his nostrils with cow dung, and still others, directly reminiscent of the Gospel, using sponges, poured excretions from the bellies of oxen and men over his eyes. But this is the Gospel, and we recall the famous scene when a sponge was given to Christ. He was straightway suspended by his feet to the two small columns on which rested a block of stone that stood near the bronze she-wolf and hyena whose necks were bent down. We recall that two thieves were crucified next to Christ, one on the right and one on the left, and Nikitas Koniates also speaks of this but slightly differently, but it's the same story. In fact, he was hanged between two columns connected by a stone. But the stone is Golgotha, the rocky hill on which 3 crucifixion crosses were placed. Here is another image where 2 thieves were crucified next to Christ on columns. This is reflected in Egyptian mythology. We have already mentioned that the method of form codes revealed that the biography of Jesus Christ and Emperor Andronikos overlaps with the life story of the Egyptian god Osiris. Here is one of the images of the resurrected Osiris. He is in the center, and to the right and left are conventional, but nevertheless now well recognizable, 2 columns on which 2 thieves were crucified. One column on the right with a certain animal crucified on it, tied to that column. And on the left, another column with a certain animal crucified, also tied to the column. This, I repeat, we know from the Gospels and from the biography of Emperor Andronikos. Another similar image. This was a canon in ancient Egypt, the risen god Osiris, who is also Jesus Christ. On the right and left, again, 2 columns, to which some animals are tied. According to the Gospels, these are the 2 thieves. These are essentially the same figures that Nikitas Koniates speaks about. Next is the descent from the cross. And now we can conclude our brief narrative about the method of form codes, which overlapped the biography of Emperor Andronikos Komnenos onto the biography of Jesus Christ, according to the Gospels and ancient texts that provide more detailed descriptions of the Passion of Christ, in accordance with the Christian tradition. You can learn more about this material in the halls of our new Chronology Museum in Yaroslavl, where you can explore the information that we are unable to cover in this brief online presentation.
In the Multimedia Museum of the New Chronology, in Hall, The Era of Christ, there is a module that explains the method of form codes. In the module, Comparative Biography of Jesus Christ and the Byzantine Emperor Andronikos I Komnenos, interactive screens showcase the most significant parallels in their biographies. Visitors can also learn who calculated the date of the birth of Christ and when the well-known method of dating was introduced. Anatoly Timofeyevich, thank you very much.
Thank you, Svetlana, for these broadcasts. They are very important. We are very pleased to meet with our viewers and future visitors to our museum in Yaroslavl. Goodbye, all the best.
In our next broadcast, Anatoly Fomenko will talk about the overlap of the biography of the Russian Grand Prince Andrei Boголюбский onto the biography of Andronikos Christ, discovered through the use of the method of form codes. We look forward to seeing you in a week on the channel of the Multimedia Museum of the New Chronology.